My name is Chelsea Silva. I'm with River Network, and you are joining us for our Flow training series, which is a 4-part call series with the Colorado Watershed Planning Peer Learning Network. Today's call focuses on setting flow goals and objectives through your watershed planning process. And during today's call, we don't have a huge group right now, but we would love for you to add your questions to the chat box. I think we can most likely allow you to come off mic too, if that is more comfortable. I think that with a smaller group, that's just can be easier. So we can also accommodate that today. And I just wanted to flag that at the end of this call, if you wouldn't mind taking our 2-minute evaluation to help us improve, we really do value your feedback. For today's call, we have some group agreements. The first is to respect our diversity. What this means is that everyone has their own life experiences and they come to this space with those experiences, and that impacts how they show up. We value this diversity as a group and respect how it affects each of us. The second is take space, make space. We share thoughts and ideas openly and make room for others to share their perspectives. The third is assume positive intent and consider your impact. Words matter, and we honor those around us and recognize and take accountability for how our words and actions impact others. The fourth is listen to understand and respond with curiosity. So we listen with intention and we listen with attention and speak with intention. Where there are opportunities for learning and connection, we bring others into this room and into the conversation instead of calling them out. And the fifth is recognize your power in the room. We come to shared spaces with different backgrounds, lived experiences, and positions, holding power in different ways. We may also be from different kinds of organizations and agencies that carry inherent power dynamics. So please consider this as you share this space. Thank you for those who are popping in now. We're just going through the introduction before we start our presentations. For those who don't know, River Network is a national nonprofit that works to grow and strengthen a transformational network of water justice and river advocates. You can learn more about us on our website at rivernetwork.org. We have a membership program, which we have free options, and we also have a plethora of resources online for you, meant for you to help you in your work in the water space. So please check that out and join us for other events. We have an online community too, where you can connect with people both within Colorado, which is really the audience of this peer learning network, and outside the state. I see really interesting posts with this online community, and you don't actually have to use the platform if you're like me and want nothing to do with social media. You'd rather just have your email. You don't have to use the tool. You can just communicate with people through email. So check that out. Finally, we have our flagship event, River Rally, coming up next year in San Antonio, and we welcome you all to join us. If you're joining us for the first time through this Watershed Planning Peer Learning Network, this is a space for Colorado practitioners who are working on watershed planning to connect and share resources and share lessons learned, challenges, all through these online gatherings as well as in-person. We also host a website called coloradosmp.org, where if you're looking to work on any part of a watershed planning process, you can go there to find case studies and information. And we hope that if you're not part of the network and you're working on watershed planning in Colorado, that you'll join us. You're here and you know this, but this is part of this Flow training series. This is call 2 of 4. And we welcome you to invite your colleagues to this space to learn about the how-tos policies and tools for flow restoration and protection in Colorado. Our next call is scheduled for Tuesday, August 26th, so we hope you'll join us then as well. I want to thank our sponsors, the Colorado Water Conservation Board, Western Resource Advocates, St. Vrain and Left Hand Water Conservancy District, the Walton Family Foundation, and also Mighty Arrow Family Foundation. We couldn't have done this training series without these folks, and we really are grateful for their support. Okay, enough from me. Let me share with you what we'll be talking about today. First, we'll hear from Seth Mason with Lotic Hydrological. Seth will present on crafting responsive flow goals and objectives. After Seth's presentation, we'll have a quick Q&A session so you can ask Seth all the questions that you have for him. And then we're going to pass it over to Daniel Boys with the Rio Grande Headwaters Restoration Project on how his group set flow goals through their watershed planning process. We'll have another Q&A and then we'll wrap it up. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and pass the mic over to Seth.
All right, how are we doing with the screen share?
Looks good.
All right, very good. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. I am here, as Chelsea mentioned, to discuss with you all ideas regarding the setting of goals and objectives around flows in environmental planning processes. So the outline for today's presentation involves a quick discussion about how we move beyond good intentions in our planning efforts, and specifically how we think about setting objectives as one means for moving beyond good intentions. Then we were going to spend a little bit of time talking about presenting on some objective setting outcomes from around Colorado in places that I've been privileged to be involved in planning. And then I will wrap up with some ideas about tools that you might bring to your planning process to help you in an objective setting exercise. I am hopeful that by the end of the discussion today, you'll have some new ideas or some new insights that you can bring back to any objective setting exercise that you might undertake in your watershed planning process or your stream management planning process. So we're going to start with this idea that we want to move beyond good intentions. I would say just about anybody who starts down the path of a watershed planning effort or a stream management planning effort or an integrated water management planning effort has good intentions. What we want to be aware of is that despite our good intentions, there are hazards and there are pitfalls that can affect a planning effort that can hinder its success over the long run. And in my view, setting clear objectives is one of the most critical things that you can bring to a planning process to avoid this common pitfall, which is an effort built around vaguely stated goals or vaguely stated objectives. And the challenge there, if you are building a planning process around these kind of vague notions, you end up in a world saturated with ambiguity, and it can be really hard to coordinate actions among your stakeholder groups. It can be difficult over the long term to adapt your management actions to changing conditions in a watershed or changing stakeholder conditions. It can be exceedingly difficult to measure success toward or away from your goals. And there generally is a lack of accountability that can affect a process that is built around vaguely stated goals and objectives. So here are some examples of vaguely stated goals. Now, the term vaguely stated is not meant to be derogatory in any way. Goals, by their nature, are often stated vaguely. That's not necessarily a problem. And so in your planning effort, you might have a goal, which is to enhance flows for riparian areas. Fantastic. You might want to provide better flows for adult trout. Great. You might want to manage flows to improve water quality or improve flows for recreational boating. All great goals, but very unspecific by their nature and can, due to all the things that we just talked about, hinder your progress toward achievable and relevant planning outcomes. So what's an alternative to building a planning process around these vaguely stated goals? Well, we can build out objectives. We can build them out in a manner that engenders success. And one of the ways that we can do that is to think about building SMART objectives. This is a useful acronym that can help us think about the components of an objective or the thinking that we bring to an objective setting exercise to make sure that they are sound and most useful and most durable to the planning effort over the long term. A SMART objective is specific, it's measurable, it's achievable, it's relevant, and it's time-bound. What do we mean by specific? Well, a SMART objective clearly defines what needs to be achieved, where it needs to be achieved, for whom or for what. A measurable objective includes quantifiable indicators to track progress or success. An achievable objective is one that evaluates the available resources, political will, legal constraints, ecological potential associated with a suite of potential actions that could be used to achieve the objective. A relevant objective is one that contributes directly to the overarching environmental goals. And a time-bound objective is one that sets clear timelines or deadlines for achievement. Okay, we'll go through each of these in turn, and as we go through them, we'll just go through a little toy exercise here of building out an objective around a vague goal. So in this case, our vague goal is to improve conditions for native fish. Fantastic. But we want to be specific. We want to ask ourselves, is this precise? Is it precise enough for our needs? Are we clearly defining what needs to be achieved, where, or for whom, or for what? And the answer to that, I would suggest, is no. So how can we make this more specific? Well, maybe what we're after is actually enhancing midsummer habitat quality for juvenile cutthroat trout in Upper Deer Creek. Much more specific, still very much relevant to our overarching goal. All right, we want to also make sure that our objective is measurable. We want to ask ourselves, how are we going to track progress toward or away from this objective? We want to define some quantifiable indicators that can allow for that objective evaluation. So in this case, we're going to build in a measurable component to our objective. And we're going to state that we want to eliminate low flow periods where flows are less than 5 CFS for 3 or more days in a row during July and August across all year types. That is something that we can measure. If we have the ability to measure stream flow in this stream, we can assess whether or not we've achieved our objective. We can evaluate success now and over the long term. We also want to make sure our objective is achievable. We're going to ask ourselves, is this realistic? Is it feasible given current water availability, flexibility and infrastructure, legal constraints, things of that nature? So in our case here, maybe we do some water rights simulation modeling work. This is pretty typical in the planning efforts that I'm involved in that relate to flows. We do this kind of engineering variety evaluation and identify that, yeah, it does look like there's potential for something like a CWCB leasing effort, or it's the CWCB leasing program applied to some agricultural water rights in this basin, or coordination with an upstream reservoir operation to produce this desired outcome, which is to eliminate these low flow periods. So we've identified that, yes, it does seem like this is achievable. Doesn't mean that it's imminently achievable, but it does seem like it's within the world of possibilities. And when we want to ask ourselves next, is this objective relevant? Does it matter to our goal, our overall goal of improving conditions for native fish. In this case, we evaluate relevancy by consulting with CPW staff, by checking against the academic research. And we do identify that in Deer Creek, it does look like the success of the juvenile cohort within the cutthroat trout population is the most significant bottleneck to long-term population resilience. So we've convinced ourselves that this is a relevant objective. And finally, we want to make sure this objective is time-bound. We don't want to work in a world of infinite time horizons. We don't want to just put this out there and see what happens. We want to give ourselves some pretty clear direction for checking in and determining whether or not we have in fact met our objective. So in this case, we're going to say that this objective is bounded within a 5-year timeline. So if we take this thinking then, and we use it to build out a single objective in text, we might write it out like this: within the next 5 years, enhance midsummer habitat quality for juvenile cutthroat trout in Upper Deer Creek by eliminating low flow periods where flows are less than 5 CFS for 3 or more days in a row during July and August across all year types. Quite verbose, not nearly as elegant as improve conditions for native fish. Certainly harder to build a public outreach campaign around, right? The goal is easier in that case. But this is much more useful over the long term as you work with your stakeholder group to actually build out actions that can make a meaningful contribution toward your goal. So let's look at a few examples from planning efforts that I've been engaged in around Colorado, where we've worked to build out, excuse me, smart objectives around flows. I want to note here, these these are not intended to be instructive. They're not intended to tell you how to build objectives in your situation, but rather to provide you with some sense of the kind of diversity of objective setting that you might encounter in different geographies among different stakeholder groups that are directed by different overall planning goals. So trout.
Seth, you kind of went out a little bit. I don't know if you're frozen a little bit. Maybe go off camera.
Great.
Like this.
Am I back? Can you guys hear me?
You're back now, yes. We
Okay.
missed, yeah, go on.
Sorry, I just got a note that our internet connection in the office here is unstable. I apologize if that affects the discussion. Okay, so a couple examples from around Colorado. I'm not sure where I blipped out. Intended to provide you with kind of a sense of the variability that you might encounter in different planning settings. So this is from the Crystal River, some planning that we did some years ago. The objective here is to improve summer habitat conditions for adult trout in the Crystal between this bridge and a ditch. We wanted to improve minimum flows to a range between 25 and 45 CFS daily, measured at the Thomas Road Stream Bridge, or Thomas Road Bridge stream gauge. We verified that this was achievable based on some simulation modeling, and we verified that it was achievable in certain year types. So at a certain frequency, but not at all frequencies, not in every year type. We determined that this was relevant by doing some habitat suitability modeling and evaluating outcomes against habitat suitability criteria. And we set some time bounds here, both in terms of the period of the year that we would be interested in maintaining these conditions. So midsummer to early fall, and then we set a 5-year time horizon. Different example here. This is from the Eagle River. This is an objective focused on the well-being of riparian areas. So our specific objective was to promote recruitment of cottonwood on floodplains along the Eagle River between the towns of Eagle and Gypsum. Our measurable criteria here was a 3-day annual peak flow magnitude greater than 4,000 CFS measured at a stream gauge in Gypsum. We did some simulation modeling and evaluated the feasibility here and identified a frequency over which this was feasible. We based our objective based on some first principles research that comes out of riparian and wetland ecology literature, and then built out a 10-year timeline or 10-year time horizon with an effectiveness review after 8 years for this objective. Last one here, this is from the Yampa River up in Steamboat. So some work focused on improving conditions for summer habitat conditions for native fish and sport fish in the Yampa River through the town of Steamboat Springs. The measurable criteria here was focused on water temperatures relative to the chronic water quality standard of 18.3 degrees Celsius, measured at a specific USGS stream flow gauge. We did some simulation modeling, temperature modeling, and reservoir release modeling to evaluate achievability here. We worked closely with CPW aquatic biologists and other researchers at USGS to determine which temperatures over which duration were in fact important for reducing stress for native and sport fish. And then we built out some time criteria here regarding the period of each year over which this objective needed to be achieved between July 1st and August 1st. And this is an annual effort with actually no time bound at the tail end. All right. So again, just some ideas. My hope is to reinforce the notion that you can end up going in different directions with your objective setting, even if ultimately you're focused on building objectives around flows. It doesn't always need to be built around low flows for sport fish, for example. You don't always end up in the world of R2 cross. You can end up in different places. So what are some of the tools that are available to you all as you think about building out objectives in your watershed? They are diverse. We have a pretty wide range of environmental flow tools. I've kind of been to these. These include things like R2 cross, boatable days assessments, effective discharge modeling, indicators of hydrological alteration, River 2D, PHAB sim, various bioenergetic modeling approaches, and water quality modeling. So quite a diverse array of assessment methods, numerical models, and other quantitative tools that you can use to evaluate ecosystem conditions and provide either numerical thresholds or statistical summaries or other information that can help you characterize environmental or recreational water needs. These tools can be super useful because they can help you identify those important thresholds or event frequencies or event durations or any number of metrics that might become success criteria that are baked into the measurable part of your SMART objective. And this is the kind of the most familiar set of tools that people bring to objective setting exercises in these planning efforts. Somewhat less frequently used, but something that I like to use a lot, are causal chain models. These are diagrams that visually map out cause and effect relationships within a watershed or a stream ecosystem. They show how different factors like land use or pollution sources or water diversions link to specific environmental outcomes. Think things like degraded water quality, low stream flow, or habitat loss. These are models that you can build in a group or a workshop setting with guidance from domain experts or other technical personnel. Alternatively, if you don't want to start from scratch and build these things up, you can start with causal chain models that are available from US EPA. That's the graphic that we're looking at here. This is one that I pulled down from EPA just a couple days ago. And you can start with this and then you can modify it to better reflect your local conditions. But the work of going through this process with a group of stakeholders is very, very valuable because it can help you trace pathways between human activities or various environmental drivers through to the problems that are that a planning process intends to address. The building out of these causal chains can also help identify key leverage points where management actions and thus your objectives might be most effective. And it can help ensure that objectives are relevant by targeting the actual causes of degradation. Problem tree analysis is another tool that you might bring to an objective setting exercise. This is a structured brainstorming tool where you start with a core problem, which is the trunk. In this case here, in the example, we're thinking about declining water quality on some river. And then you identify the direct effects of that problem. And these are the branches. So these might be stressed fish populations, closures for recreational angling and swimming, unsightly algae blooms. And then you want to work through in the other direction to identify the underlying causes of this issue. These are the roots, and they might include things like high diversion rates, reduced snowpack due to climate change, runoff from nearby urban areas, things of that nature. You can build these out in facilitated group settings that engage non-technical and technical stakeholders. It's somewhat similar to a causal chain modeling effort, although a bit simplified. And it can help, despite its simplicity, it can help users really do a kind of a mental deep dive into the root causes of a problem and can help your stakeholders, can help you and your stakeholders really avoid objectives that are focused on symptoms and help you ensure that your objectives are relevant and potentially more achievable by tackling these fundamental underlying issues. Logic models are another tool available to you all. These are visual charts that connect resources and inputs like funding and staff to planned activities and then to outputs. Did I blip out there? Are you guys still seeing me?
You're still there.
Okay. Constructing one of these models involves working backward from the ultimate goal. So you start at the end of the graphic that we're looking at here. Start at the ultimate goal, the vaguely defined goal, and then you work backward through the outcomes, the outputs, and the inputs, all the while making sure that you are paying attention to the ultimate goal, so that anything that you build out in the other spaces directly reflects that ultimate goal. These can be somewhat complex exercises. They do require some thoughtful planning by a facilitator, but they can be helpful in ensuring that you've got a clear logical pathway that exists between any planned actions and your desired end goals, and can be crucial for defining achievable objectives that are of course relevant to the larger goal. Stakeholder mapping is another tool that you might use. This involves identifying all of the relevant stakeholders, landowners, agencies, water users, environmental groups, et cetera, and their interests, their influence, the potential impact that they might have on objectives, either positive or negative, and then their relationships with each other. This can be accomplished with a group via a sticky note exercise where participants are asked to identify the position of different groups or organizations or individuals within this interest influence space that's visualized on the right of the slide here. And you can have people place themselves or place other groups within this space, and then encourage them to discuss strategies for appropriately engaging stakeholders in different parts of this interest influence space. It can really help gather diverse perspectives and opinions from your local community or from your planning participants, and can help really improve the understanding of the stakeholder landscape that's critical for developing kind of achievable objectives that reflect the social and political context. Finally, we can think about scenario planning. This is a category of work that you might bring to an objective setting exercise that explores different alternative futures built on different uncertainties or variables within your system. These can include things like climate change or population growth or changes in policy or alternative water development futures. And it can help stakeholders think about how the watershed might look in the future under different outcomes. This is often supported by numerical simulation modeling, where you can explore these different what-if outcomes associated with some change in the system. And it does usually require some engagement, heavy engagement of technical personnel. But it can be super useful. I really like to use it in my work because it does encourage the development of robust objectives that are likely to be achievable and remain relevant under a range of potential future conditions. Okay, so we're coming down to the end here. So let's reflect. We think that building out SMART objectives is useful. And one thing that you all will be confronted with is in the structuring of these things, thinking through which components are informed by technical work and which are informed by social processes, engagement with your stakeholders. I like to ask groups which of these they think are technical in nature and which are social in nature, but we're not gonna have that little group activity here. And I'll just suggest to you that there's a lot of overlap between the social components here and the technical components here. Each of these
Lost you again, Seth.
objectives, well, they provide clarity, focus, and accountability. They can help transform. Yes.
You kind of went out when you were just saying that there's a lot of overlap between the social and technical. That's the last thing we heard, just FYI.
Or you all just blipped out. I think I'm back.
You're back.
Okay. Well, there's a lot of overlap. I heard you say that, and that's the point. There's a lot of overlap. Moving right along, I want to cannibalize Daniel's time here. SMART objectives are important. They provide clarity, focus, and accountability. They help us transform our vaguely stated goals into actionable and measurable targets, and they're essential for demonstrating success and adapting to change. I'd suggest that objective-based planning is often preferable to action-based planning. So that's a separate conversation. But I would suggest while you want to avoid building your planning process around vaguely stated goals, you also want to avoid building your entire planning process around a singular action, right? In both cases, you can end up with non-ideal outcomes that are relatively inflexible or hard to deal with over the long term. Okay, articulating planning objectives in terms of flow-related environmental and recreational issues and attributes is critical if your goal is to arrive at flow-related recommendations in your planning effort. Using the SMART acronym can help you think about the components of a well-defined objective. And while I've those are a great place to start. And I'd encourage you to reflect on those. Chelsea will send out the slideshow later, and that can be a great point.
You still there, Seth? You still, all right. Thanks, Seth. I think we caught your gist there at the end, which is explore the tools on your own. Thank you so much for your presentation. We have about 10 minutes for questions for Seth, and I do want to flag a question that came in, Seth, during your presentation from Bernadette on what software was used to produce the graph on the slide that talked about different quantitative tools, the R2 cross. There was a graph on that slide.
Yeah, that was a collection of tools were used to build out the information contained in that graphic. That was some years ago. That was from 2016, so I can't be entirely sure what we use, but in all of our work, we're using custom coding and generally in R, but in Python too, sometimes spreadsheets. So I couldn't tell you exactly which one that came out of, but the information reflected there reflected hydrological simulation outputs that were coming out of state mod, reflected two-dimensional habitat suitability modeling, and I'm trying to think of what else. Some characterization of return frequencies of different low flow events. So kind of indicators of hydrological alteration type of view. So a bit of a mashup. I hope that's helpful.
Other question, feel free to raise your hand or come off mic. Laura?
Yes.
And then Michael, I see you. I'll have you come on next.
Cool. Thanks, Seth. That was super interesting. I was wondering if you provided a lot of tools, and there was definitely a pretty broad range of them, and some of them would obviously require, different levels of input. And I was just wondering if you had any guidance on sort of selecting a tool or thinking about where to start.
Yeah, I think it really depends on the context of your planning effort, right? Some planning efforts are really driven by a singular organization that has a planning goal that's reflective of their organization's mission, and the stakeholder engagement part of the planning is really about exploring potential actions, and is less about collectively gathering input and reflecting back to the community what the community's goals are. And so it depends. So in the situation where you are a single organization and you're marching forward with a planning effort and you're not trying to generate consensus among a community, then doing something like the stakeholder mapping exercise may or may not be entirely relevant to you. It might be more critical for you to engage with technical staff from CPW or from USGS in something like a causal chain modeling exercise, where you're really ensuring that you understand the primary pathways that affect a potential management action, the relationship between a potential management action and an environmental characteristic, and any of the kind of secondary or tertiary effects that management action might have that might be counterproductive or undesirable. So yeah, it depends.
Thanks for that question, Laura. Michael Corman, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, thanks. Seth, you mentioned an example I was curious about in, I don't know what river or creek it was, but you mentioned in gypsum a high flow magnitude over 4,000 CFS or something. I was just curious what the planning process was there, if you know, and what if you remember more about like the goal there for that
Yeah,
particular one.
sure. Yeah, so that objective reflected a community goal there, which was to preserve and promote riparian resilience in this section of the river corridor where you have unconfined floodplains, where you've got the river is not in a canyon, it's not going through steep glacial material. It's actually, actively overtopping and inundating relatively large areas of floodplain. So these are zones where those lateral connections between the river and its floodplain are expected to exert some significant control on the extent and characteristics of the riparian forest. And so in thinking about this particular geography, then we wanted to understand what are the kind of hydrological characteristics that are likely associated with the promotion of resilient forests that have diverse age class structures. And so that was based on inundation modeling of the floodplain, thinking about the scour dynamics that are necessary to create a patchwork of diverse riparian vegetation. And that's where you come up with the 4,000 CFS number. And then some reflection on, well, what is the kind of historical frequency of these events? And then if we look to the future and think about different climate change, potential climate change scenarios or water development outcomes, how are those frequencies likely to be altered? So as a thinking about all of these different things that came together in the development of that particular objective.
And what creek was that on, or river?
That's on the Eagle River between towns of Eagle and Gypsum. If you drive through, if you drive an I-70 through there, you'll notice that the robust cottonwood forests, well, they used to start down west of Gypsum, but there was a big fire down there a couple of years ago. Still some down there. Then they extend up to about Red Canyon, which is a little east of the town of Eagle. And then beyond there, the lateral extent of the forest shrinks considerably as the river becomes steeper and the floodplain becomes narrower.
Thanks for that question, Michael. Are there other questions out there? I've got a question. Oh, here we go. Casey Lyons. Go for it, Casey.
Thanks. This is a pretty vague question, so bear with me as I try to phrase it, as we were told not to do things too vaguely. So you mentioned that if your goals or objectives are too vague, or if you use action-based goals, you can find yourself in sort of an inflexible position as you get farther into the planning process. Can you explain that again and maybe talk a little bit about how having a vague goal leads to inflexibility down the line, please?
Yeah, so let me shift it a little bit. So having a vague goal can challenge you in building out actions that are responsive or that are accountable or that are measurable over the long term and ensure that you are in fact achieving your desired outcome. So that's the challenge with vaguely stated goals and building your planning process solely around vaguely stated goals. And that doesn't mean that they shouldn't exist within your planning process, but that you just need to support those goals with something else in order to build actions that can help you achieve your goals. You need to build some additional insight and thinking around those goals. On the other side, if you start with a particular action and then you realize you build your plan around an action, and let's imagine that then 6 months later or 2 years later, that action becomes completely infeasible due to funding constraints or some change in the political landscape, well, now you've built your whole planning process around something that can't be done. And so you're left wondering, well, what is it that I brought to this planning process that is now transferable? And hopefully there are bits that are transferable that you can extract and use to develop some goals or identify and pursue a different action. But that's where you end up in the world of inflexibility. So on the vaguely stated goal side, you're in the world of infinite possibilities, and that can just be very hard to the possibilities are infinite. So what do? We don't know what to do. On the other side, we're only doing this one thing, and if we can't do this one thing, we don't know what to do. So those are the challenges with building your planning, either around vaguely stated goals or around specific actions, in my view. Does that help clarify, Casey, what I was saying?
Yeah, that's totally great. Thanks a lot. I appreciate that.
Thank you for that question, Casey. Seth, I have one last question for you, and then we'll pass it over to Daniel unless anybody else has a question. So River Network's in the middle of supporting a watershed planning effort, and we're in this stage right now of how do you set flow goals and objectives and other goals and objectives. And one of the challenges we're facing is that we have all of this technical information about the flow in our rivers. We have a stream health assessment we just completed. And our challenge is that we're uncomfortable with being the ones to essentially take that information and build these flow goals and objectives without other stakeholder input. So in your opinion or your experience, I guess at the same time, we don't want to put that kind of language building on stakeholders or people who are participating who don't have that knowledge, right? So in your experience, is it productive to build out some goals and objectives and allow those to be something that your stakeholders who may not be technically, able or don't have that knowledge, for them to kind of percolate on those ideas and then provide feedback and modify? Or do you just build from scratch together, knowing that you are going to face that challenge of lack of knowledge?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it gets to Laura's question a little bit as well. In most of the planning settings that I've been involved in Colorado, where we're thinking about flows and alternative management opportunities for flows, they're non-regulatory. So you're not moving into a planning process where you can, affect outcomes in a very definite way. They are largely aspirational and hinge significantly on participation. Well, they hinge on buy-in for starters, and then buy-in largely among your community, and then more specifically, focus participation and engagement with some subset of your stakeholders. And so I think it's really, really important and useful in a lot of these settings to engage your stakeholders in the objective setting exercise. And that's why in each of those, not in each, but in many of those example tools that I brought up, they are kind of stakeholder engagement based tools that can bring stakeholders together around some different component of objective setting. And that doesn't mean that you have to get your stakeholders to define in the way that I did on one of those early slides an objective built around specific, numerical targets. That's probably not reasonable. But what might be more important to you is to make sure that you are reflecting back to the community their thoughts, priorities, and preferences about how the system works, and then helping connect the dots for them in when you have an objective that you've maybe developed internally that looks maybe something like the thing that I put up, helping them connect the dots between that thing and the perspectives that they brought to the planning exercise, right? It can help you tell that story back to them to ensure that you've got that broad support and buy-in. So I think it's critically important to bring them in, even though I think you largely would not expect them to have a hand in the penning of the actual objective.
Thanks, Seth. Yeah, I think that the value of that storytelling piece and share back and communication is also super critical. Great. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to pass the mic over to Daniel, and Daniel, I'll share your slides, and we'll keep on moving.
Great. Thanks, Chelsea. Hi, everyone. My name is Daniel Boyes. I'm the director at the Rio Grande Headwaters Restoration Project, and we're a nonprofit watershed group in the San Luis Valley. And yeah, so I'm going to kind of build off of what Seth was talking about and give a bit of like a case study and some examples of our development of flow targets and goals and objectives on the Rio Grande. Next slide. So just to give a little bit of context for our planning effort, back in 2016, the Rio Grande Basin Roundtable got really excited about stream management planning locally and really took the opportunity to prioritize locally some rivers to do stream management plans on. And so this map shows those three rivers, Saguache Creek, the Rio Grande, and Conejos River. And then our organization, the Restoration Project, was asked to sort of facilitate this stream management planning process. And so today I'm mostly going to talk about our flow work on the Rio Grande. Next slide. So this is kind of just an overview of the flow data that was generated to support this process. So we started the whole process by sort of forming a technical advisory team. And so that team was made up of representatives from, diverse group of stakeholders, so like state, federal agency representatives, local nonprofits, water conservancy, conservation districts, irrigation districts, et cetera. So a pretty diverse group, and they really guided this whole process and the development of this flow data. And so we worked with American Whitewater as well as Lotic Hydrological on a boatable days assessment. And so that really got at recreational flow preferences. We also did a minimum flows assessment, meant to protect aquatic life. And then we also did a little bit of work looking at flushing flows, or sort of those channel maintenance flows. And we had a pretty huge consultant team who really helped out with all this work, and they're listed there at the bottom. Next slide. So just a couple of notes from our process, and I'm going to talk about like kind of the things that made our planning process successful, and then some of the things that we're still working on, and I think we could build upon. So obviously, I think this applies to every watershed or stream management planning process, but starting with building rapport and building trust. And I think we were very lucky. We really started this planning process with a lot of eagerness from the roundtable and local stakeholders to do these stream management plans. So we started with a lot of kind of a foundation of trust, which really was helpful. And something that I think is really important is just from the outset, and particularly when you're talking about flows work, really being clear about what the expected outcomes of the data you're collecting and the goals you're going to be talking about setting, like where are we planning to go as a group with this, just so that people are clear about what the end game is. And then, also, and I think, again, this applies to any planning process, but having kind of a local champion for this type of work can really go a long way. And so, like, for example, on the Conejos River, there was actually a precedent of some flow work actually already happening with the Conejos Water Conservancy District and Trout Unlimited. And so the Conejos Water Conservancy District was really a great like local champion in that area. And then on the Rio Grande, we had different local champions, but that really can go a long way to building that trust and keeping people engaged throughout the process. Next slide. So I wanted to just give kind of a brief overview of these different assessments that were done. So starting with the Boatable Days study. So this really starts with a recreational user survey. And that was a really important part of this, was just to figure out who are all of these local recreators and particularly boaters, both private boaters, but also all of the outfitters and folks who really know the river well. And so we worked with American Whitewater to put together this survey that asked people about their flow preferences for different reaches, boatable reaches of the Rio Grande. And that's where all the data came from for this Boatable Days assessment. So next slide. So this figure just shows some of the data outputs from that assessment. So here you see there's, for this particular reach of the Rio Grande, which was Wagon Wheel Gap to South Fork, you've got hydrographs representing like a dry, average, and wet year type for the period of record that we looked at, and then results from that Boatable Days assessment that show what people said was like a lower acceptable flow for this reach, kind of the optimal flow range, and that's that green area, and then kind of the upper acceptable, like an adventure higher flow range. And so that, yeah, it's a really great, this assessment is really great. Like the visuals that come out of it are fantastic for planning. Something that we added to it that I thought was really helpful is that we identified that there were also physical infrastructure limitations on recreation in the form of low bridges. And so you can see the Wagon Wheel Gap trestle hazard, Elk Creek Bridge hazard are listed there at the flows at which those bridges become impassable or hazardous. And so we really wanted to document that sometimes there are physical constraints to recreation on the Rio Grande. Next slide. And this is just a photo of that Wagon Wheel Gap bridge. So you can see this was, I think, during like June of 2019, a really big water year, and you can tell that you would not want to try to boat underneath that. And so there are some instances of that type of infrastructure. So we wanted to make sure to include that. Next slide. And this is just another output from the Boatable Days assessment. So this shows the number of boatable days in each of those categories, the lower, optimal, and upper acceptable ranges in those different year types, the dry, average, and wet years, and is just breaking it out by month. So there's just a number of graphics that come out of it that are really valuable and helpful as you kind of talk through the data with your stakeholder group. Next slide. So for the minimum flows assessment, we spent a lot of time thinking about the right methodology, and there was a question about that earlier. It's really, it was tough to kind of hone in on like what was the best method to use to look at minimum flows, which was something that our stakeholder group was really interested in understanding, and where a lot of opportunities are in terms of flow work in the Rio Grande. We ultimately landed on R2 Cross, and it is a really fantastic tool. It also has, with any tool, it has some limitations, but our technical advisory team really liked it because, it's a field-based tool. It's really usable at the reach scale, which is the scale we were working at. And it's the tool that's used for in-stream flow water rights, or at least the primary tool. And so I think that it has a lot of credibility, had a lot of credibility in our community because of that. And then I would also just note that we had a lot of support from the Colorado Parks and Wildlife in-stream flow staff as we were kind of getting going and starting to do R2 cross field work across our planning area, and that was hugely helpful, and they recommended that we use it. So that's what we used. Next slide. And here's an example of the data output from R2 cross on the Rio Grande. And so you can see that those dry, average, and wet year hydrographs. And then the light blue and the light green lines represent the winter flow target and the summer flow target that was generated from R2 cross. And so this really, again, and I think another reason that our team really liked it is that it is really focused on aquatic life and fish habitat. And that's really what our group was really interested in protecting. And so these minimum flows are meant to protect aquatic life, with that winter and summer flow target. Something that we didn't do that we're kind of looking at doing now is that you can kind of dive into the data a little bit deeper and look at some shoulder season ramping up or down flows to sort of show that transition, because it's not like you go from winter into summer, it's not that black and white. And so we want to kind of nuance those flow targets a little bit. And so you can see in this example that the flow targets are being met. The table there shows the percent of days in summer and winter when the flow targets are being met. They're being met except for in the winter on a dry year. And that's something that we saw really across the watershed, and particularly in the upper reaches of our watershed, is that the winter flow targets, if there was a flow target that wasn't being met, it was typically the winter flows. Next slide. And then an exercise that we did that I think was really helpful was after we collected all this R2 cross data, we sat down with our stakeholder group, and especially with Colorado Parks and Wildlife fisheries biologists. We kind of combed through a bunch of photos of different reaches we tried to find photos, showing some of these, roughly some of these flow targets. And so like this is a example of a reach on the Conejos River that's pretty close to the summer minimum flow target. It's not exact, but it's pretty close. And so just to kind of ground truth that data and, just get some buy-in and support for the data that was collected, we just kind of went through and said, well, here's what these minimum flow targets actually look like on the ground. And does this kind of make sense? And it was just kind of an interesting exercise, and the stakeholder group was like, yeah, absolutely, this makes sense in terms of the output for minimum flows. So I found that to be a really useful process. Next slide. And then, yeah, so finally we did a little bit of work looking at flushing flows, both in terms of bed mobilizing flows, so like the flows at which the average sediment size would actually mobilize, and then also the flows at which your floodplain would become activated. So this table is kind of, there's a lot of information in here, but there's some information on the frequency of bed mobility flows, and then also the actual flow rate at which overbanking occurs, to get at some of those questions of, how can we ensure that channel maintenance flows are occurring, and then also that those floodplain activating flows are occurring. And part of that was a tracer gravel study, which was really interesting, with some painted rocks in the river during runoff, and we kind of measured the distance that they moved during that runoff period. It's pretty neat. Next slide. So getting into some of our flow goals. With all of this data, we had a huge amount of data that we'd collected, and we really sat down with our stakeholder group and technical advisory team and talked about, well, what are the local priorities as far as flow projects and flow enhancement, and then what are the main opportunities. And the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about some of the constraints that are sort of inherent in the Rio Grande Basin that limit some of the opportunities. But there were sort of a couple of things that really came up as priorities and that were achievable. So one was meeting minimum flow targets, particularly the winter flows in critical reaches of the river to support aquatic life. So there were several reaches where those minimum flow targets in the winter were not being met. And our goals were around what can we do to meet those winter flow targets. And then another one was, and just recognizing the importance of recreation on the Rio Grande, was maintaining or increasing boatable days when possible. And really the focus area was Rio Grande Reservoir to Del Norte, which is really the area that does get boated frequently. And, I think this is one thing that I think is still evolving with our stream management plan process, is that some of our goals lack some of the components of a SMART goal that Seth just went through. And, there are reasons for that. There's, I think there are things that we'd like to make more specific, but at the time, what we were comfortable with was leaving some room for flexibility and really kind of refining these objectives and refining these projects over time. So next slide. So this figure shows, and this is kind of putting into context the Rio Grande Basin, shows water rights appropriations over time, which is the blue area. And then you've got those dry, average, and wet year hydrographs overlaid, as well as a particularly wet year, the blue line, which is 1985. And so this is just meant to illustrate the fact that water rights are fully over appropriated in the Rio Grande Basin, and this graph is specific to the Rio Grande River itself. And so by the late 1800s, the river was fully appropriated, and there was really no more water available physically in the river. So even in a really wet year, that green hydrograph, even in a wet year, you're only hitting those late 1800s water rights. And so that means that there's still junior water rights from the 1900s that, in most years, unless you have a crazy extreme year like 1985, are not being met. What that means is that, free river conditions essentially don't exist on the Rio Grande. And water that is flowing past head gates and down to the New Mexico state line is really for delivery of water obligations for the Rio Grande Compact. And so just the nature of how over-appropriated the Rio Grande is makes it challenging to, there just isn't a ton of water available to do flow projects. There is some water. There's well augmentation water owned by augmentation groups like the San Luis Valley Water Conservancy District. The groundwater management subdistricts in the valley also have augmentation water. Colorado Parks and Wildlife has some water rights that they have some flexibility in terms of when they can release that. But it's a relatively small amount of water compared to the ag water rights that are stored in reservoirs. And so for that reason, with the fact that we're so over appropriated, each year the flow project opportunities are very different. So in a wet year, there's a lot more opportunity to potentially retime some releases to increase the number of boatable days. But for example, in a dry year like this year, it's a lot more limited. And so the local priorities are really more focused on protecting aquatic life and meeting those minimum flow targets, meeting or exceeding, and then also looking at water temperatures and making sure we don't get too hot. And so that's really the primary reason that our technical advisory team and our community stakeholders felt like we don't want to get too specific, because every year we have different conditions that set us up to either be able to achieve some objective or not. Over the last couple of years, since the stream management plan was completed in 2020, these conversations have continued, and I think we're getting closer to being able to formalize some of these objectives and make them more specific. But yeah, at the time, we wanted to really kind of leave it flexible and voluntary. So next slide, please. So I just kind of wanted to go through a couple of lessons learned from our process, and then and also just things that we're wanting to continue working on into the future. So one thing is that, and I think this is really important for folks who are considering using R2 Cross, it's a really great tool, and we used it throughout the watershed, but it does have limitations. So one is the size of your stream or river. When you start getting channel widths that are, nearing 100 feet or wider, the tool gets a little bit wonky and the data is a little bit less reliable. And so that's just something to note. It's something that we ran into. And so it does have that limitation. It's really more, I think it just works better on some of the smaller streams. Also, R2 Cross relies really heavily on critical riffles. And so when you're looking for your R2 Cross sites, you're scoping out and trying to find the perfect habitat limiting riffle. And in low gradient flat streams like you get on the valley floor, like the Rio Grande flowing through Alamosa and down to New Mexico, it's very flat. And so it's really hard to find that critical riffle. And so that again just makes the process a little bit harder. So if you're working in a low gradient stream, it's just something to consider. And then I mentioned this a little bit, but we got our winter and our summer flow targets, and that's fantastic. But we'd like to build on that and get some more nuanced information about what those targets should be in those shoulder seasons in the fall and the spring, and in particular to help inform reservoir ramping and how they should be potentially looking at changing releases. Another big thing is just making this data, once it's developed, accessible. So something that we have really found is that some of the boatable days data is on American Whitewater's website, which is great, but not everyone knows to look there, and particularly folks who are maybe just coming for a weekend trip to do a float trip. And so right now what we're working on is putting the boatable days data on a really easy to use website that people can go to and just, okay, for this reach, here's the current flow rate, and here's kind of those user preferences. So should we boat this reach or not? And just making that information really easy to find and really easy to use. Another recommendation is just consulting with experts. So the in-stream flow staff at Colorado Parks and Wildlife and CWCB were really helpful throughout this process and really helped guide us. And so I just really recommend having those conversations early on when you're thinking about what tools to use and based on what your objectives are. And of course, your consultant team can help with that too. And then finally, refining your objectives based on local priorities and opportunities. And this is a lot of what Seth was talking about, I think, is really, you can collect all the data you want, but ultimately, what you should be focusing on is what the community values are around flows, whether it's recreational or fish habitat or, maintaining riparian areas, really focusing on those priorities and then what the opportunities really are. There may be some data that gets generated that says you should look at a 5,000 CFS flushing flow to maintain like aquatic habitat and interstitial space in rocks. But if the physical infrastructure isn't there or there's constraints because of like reservoir release limitations, you just need to be aware of those like constraints and opportunities going into it. And so that's something that, again, we're continuing to build on is really refining some of those objectives over time. And I think the reason that we've been able to continue this work and continue to refine our objectives is just because there is that community buy-in in the work and the trust among the stakeholders to continue that process. So I think that's all I've got, but happy to answer questions.
Thanks so much, Daniel. If folks have questions, please feel free to come off mute or raise your hand if you're so inclined. Chris? Yeah, go for it.
Daniel, thank you. Great presentation. Do you have any suggestions for engaging the water user and agricultural community in a given drainage? I'm over here on the Animas and I'm on the Animas Watershed Partnership, and we're going to be working on a stream management planning effort. To that end, I have been reaching out to local irrigation districts, ditch boards, et cetera, trying to go to their meetings. Other than that, do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, obviously just starting out by just trying to include everybody, invite everyone to meetings and get everyone at the table if they are willing to be. I think the other thing that we have found, and obviously this could vary depending on the stream or watershed you're working in, but there are oftentimes benefits to irrigators or reservoir companies associated with participating in some of this flow work. And so what are some of the potential benefits for them? And like for example, on the Conejos River, Trout Unlimited has developed a really neat partnership with the Conejos Water Conservancy District where TU will actually pay water users to store their water a little bit longer. Instead of releasing it in the summer months, they store it a little bit longer and release it in the winter when there is that habitat limiting flow rate. And so we're bolstering those winter flows. The water users are getting paid, and then a lot of them actually prefer to use that little amount of water in the winter for like stock water. And so it's a win-win. They're getting something out of it, and we're Trout Unlimited is able to really help meet those minimum winter flows. So kind of think through that and ask them what their needs are and see if there are opportunities to find some win-wins.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for that question, Chris. Any other questions? I might add, Chris, that in these, as you're launching that process, being able to have a clear idea of what you want and asking people or helping people understand that the process is intended to find commonalities and find those common areas of where your desires and hopes for the process and the plan align with their what they need or what they're already doing. We found a lot of success in framing our stream management plan in that way.
Yeah, I like that too.
Yeah, Chelsea, I agree. If I could add a little bit, I think reframing, really paying attention to your language. How are you speaking about things? And maybe you're talking about the same thing, but using the word environmental flow versus like irrigated water or something means the same in your world, but really it is a different tone as you're talking about it. So really think about the language. Another two suggestions, and this is for really any community that you're trying to outreach to, is typically the best conversations happen outside of the big public meeting, right? So you can gain more traction when you're talking one-on-one with someone and really engaging and talking about where they're coming from, what they're looking for, what are their hesitations, what are their concerns. Those conversations aren't necessarily best done in a big stakeholder meeting. And so having side conversations with people, your allies, your opposition, all those people offline, quote unquote, will be more productive. And so making sure you're investing the time for those relationships outside of the scheduled meetings will be really important. And then the third thing I'll say is if you're having trouble connecting with a certain audience, whatever it is, there's probably someone within your network that does have that connection. And so trying to find allies that you already connect with that could maybe introduce you or speak to your work and sort of hint towards collaboration, whatever it is you're looking, or just having a conversation, I think is really important. And Seth had mentioned or shared sort of like, what is your goal with each stakeholder, right? Not everyone has to be your ally. Some people just need to be neutral. Some people don't even need to agree. They just need to not like talk out loud badly and like derail the situation, right? So think about really what is your goal with each stakeholder and what level of energy you actually need to invest in them. Not everyone's going to be all in, and that's absolutely okay. Just what do you need and where are you willing to go? Really understanding those boundaries. So that's all I'll add.
Thank you.
Definitely. Are there other questions out there? Daniel, I'm curious if there aren't other questions, if you can speak to some of your learning through the flows cohort, especially potentially around some of the tools that the Colorado Water Trust has presented, and if any of those resonate or even possibilities given your constraints.
Sure. Yeah. So we're kind of just wrapping up the flows cohort, which has been fantastic, and would highly recommend it to anyone who's interested in really diving deeper into this flows work. If it's offered again, it's a great opportunity. And yeah, I do think going through that program and learning more about the tools that are out there, I think there are opportunities. We've had a lot of success on the Rio Grande with these voluntary agreements as far as flow projects go, rather than the more formalized agreements. But I do think that there's an opportunity in some of the tools that the Water Trust uses for their work to make some of our flow projects a little bit more formalized and actually boost the incentives for like water rights holders. So some of the water leasing opportunities that are out there that are being used around the state. So yeah, we're really interested in exploring those tools and actually looking at setting up a meeting with the Water Trust to talk more about how we could potentially partner with them or use some of their tools in the Rio Grande. So there's just so much out there, and we could keep learning more the more we talk with folks and collaborate and see what the different opportunities are.
Thanks, Daniel. And I just dropped a table of tools that the Colorado Water Trust has put together. It's sort of like a quick look at different tools that you can use that anything from there's in-stream flow, of course, with CWCB, the Colorado Water Conservation Board, but there's all these other ways that you can get to flow protection, flow restoration. And so I'm kind of jumping ahead. We're talking about goals and objectives today, but I just wanted to put that out there. Any other questions?
Good question for Daniel. Thanks for that great presentation. I was curious if you had any experience using the new Ag Water Protection Act that allows people to take their decreed water and lease it. I don't know a ton about it, but I've been curious to see if anybody else in the state has like started using that.
Yeah, I think I'm familiar with what you're talking about. This is like the just the recent legislation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to be honest, I'm not familiar enough with it to say if that's something that's going to change or open up new opportunities, but from the very little I know, it does sound promising and potentially something that we could use. If it's something that works for water rights holders, it could open up new opportunities for us, absolutely. Because that's one of the big challenges in the Rio Grande is that, water is decreed to be delivered to a head gate, and that's its use. And so we have to work within that system, which has a lot of limitations. So I'm hopeful that there's some opportunities there, but unfortunately don't know enough right now to say.
Thanks.
Robert, I don't want to put you on the spot.
I know, I was thinking, Robert.
Didn't drop that link. I don't know if you want to say anything more.
Oh, I'm happy to. And sorry I missed the first session. And Bernadette, I saw in the first session you actually asked about that too, so I meant to reach out. So thanks for asking again. So the egg water protection right has actually been around for a while, but it's only been available in divisions 1 and 2. As a farmer, I actually looked at it, but was actually advised by several water attorneys that you don't want to be the first one in division 1 to try to do this, because the amount of scrutiny that's going to be afforded to it. And most likely because of the cost of the transaction of going through water court, I was probably in advance going to need to find the partner that would be interested in that water. And most likely in the Brighton area where I live, it was going to be a municipality, which would probably even attract more attention to it. So I was actually totally in favor and supported the recent action where that legislation now expanded it to the rest of the state. It's not available yet. It's going to have to go through rulemaking. The Division of Water Resources will have to go through a rulemaking before it's actually available in the rest of the state. But once it is available, I think that's great partnerships. I think, and that's what I envision is being a partner with an in-stream flow with a water right holder to do this, where, the community can come together and say in advance, this sounds like a great idea, and we don't need to battle it out in water court, which seems to happen in divisions 1 and 2 all the time. So keep your eyes peeled to that's going on. There'll be a stakeholder process going on this summer for that in the rest of the state. And then hopefully after the rulemaking is concluded, it will begin to really reach out to entities to see if there's interest to try to get it done. Because on my behalf, I'd really like to see one go through.
Thank you, Robert. Well, I want to thank everyone for their participation today, and especially to Seth and Daniel for your presentations. Really appreciate it. This is recorded, so I'll share this out along with the slides and other resources after today's call. And we hope you'll join us again in August for our next opportunity in this flow series. So thank you so much, and have a good rest of your day.